Welcome to the Learning Conversations, an Education Scotland podcast presented by Chief Executive Gillian Hamilton. In every episode, Gillian is joined by teachers, professionals and experts to unpack some of the big questions and topics facing the education sector in Scotland. Over to Gillian as she introduces today's guest.
I'm delighted to be joined today by two members of the Scottish Youth Parliament, Olivia Brown and Abby Lints. A fun fact for those listening, despite the age gap, Olivia is actually my mentor and helps me understand how I can better involve the views of young people as part of my decision making as Chief Executive of Education Scotland. And we'll talk a wee bit more about that later. So welcome to the podcast, Olivia and Abby. I'm delighted to have you both here today to talk more about your work with the Scottish Youth Parliament and your shared passion to make Scotland a better place by tackling issues such as those related to education. But to kick off, I'm really keen to go back to the beginning and find out a bit more about what got you both interested in politics and where that journey with the Scottish Youth Parliament began. So who wants to go first?
Shall I go?
Olivia.
So I have been involved in the Scottish Youth Parliament since 2021. Kind of November was when I was elected. And so I was 16, just coming out the other end of the pandemic, had just done my Nat 5s, and I was about to go on and do my hires and still the kind of adjusted exam timetable.
Of course.
And so it was a very political time, and especially at the age of 16, that's when you gain the right to vote in Scotland. So I've always been interested in politics, but like at that particular point, there was the Black Lives Matter movement taking place. We'd just seen the US elections. Access to TikTok had suddenly become a thing, and that has had a massive impression on my generation and how we perceive and interact with politics. And then, of course, there was a pandemic itself, and I in particular was quite frustrated at how the education system had adapted during the pandemic, and just the fact that it felt like a lot of stuff had been done to young people rather than with young people in a lot of the adjustments that had happened. So I stood for Youth Parliament because I wasn't interested in party politics. I wasn't interested necessarily in like attending loads of protests and stuff. I wanted that sort of platform where you were working with other young people we all had the issues in common. We all had that care for young people and for the UNCRC in common. And that's why I think that youth parliaments are just such a important political vehicle, because they provide that space for young people that bypasses a lot of like the bureaucracy and infighting that comes with party politics. I'm 20 now, and I've been doing youth parliament for almost 4 years.
Fabulous. And I'm going to come back to a couple of those issues or points that you raised, but before I do that, I'm going to come to Abby to hear about what got Abby involved in the Youth Parliament.
So since I've joined high school, I've been increasingly aware of all the issues that young people face, especially at school, related to like exams and all that. And I've been a member of my school's debate team, so get interested in politics through that. I actually heard about the Scottish Youth Parliament through a presentation at my school. It was just coming up to elections time, and they were like, oh, we need people to run. And I have all these issues that I'm so passionate about. So I went home, I did some research on the Scottish Youth Parliament, and I was like, this is great.
This is for me.
Yeah, this is like wonderful. And so I took the decision to run because I felt through the Scottish Youth Parliament what my views as a young person could be heard, and I could stand up for the young views of people across Scotland.
That's fab. Both of those reasons are really fabulous. But you've both talked about the views of young people being listened to, not being done to. It must have been quite a big thing at that age to put yourself forward to stand for election. Can you tell me just a wee bit about what that felt like?
Yeah, especially I had done a bit of, for the, like, campaign-wise, I'd done a bit of public speaking as part of the debate team, but when it came to putting my views across in my campaign, it was scary because it was speaking to a group of people you'd never met before in such a large quantity of people. But it was great because you could just tell people, this is what I think, and I want to hear what you think, and this is why you should vote for me. So it's great to have that platform, and it was just overall a wonderful campaign to run.
That's great. People my age will be listening and thinking, I wish I had that confidence to stand up and to speak and to put myself forward. Was it similar for you, Olivia?
Yeah, like the first time I stood in 2021, a lot of the campaigning was online. So I did like all of my stuff on TikTok basically, because you couldn't really get around your school in the same way that you can now because a lot of the restrictions were
Of
still in
course.
place. So yeah, TikTok is what got me elected in the first instance. And then in our more recent election where I restood, it was a lot of like going into schools and speaking to assemblies and getting my friends to tell their friends to vote and going into youth clubs. And that you've hit on a really good point about SYP, which is around the skills that you develop. And like I am a very different person to who I was when I first got elected, purely because the amount of situations that I've been put in where it's like you have to stand up for yourself, you have to speak to a room of people, you have to do a podcast. Like you change quite dramatically as a person, and for the better, I think, because of the opportunities that you get. And I think that is also the beauty of youth work, because SYP, we're a political organisation, but we're also a youth work organisation, and I always say we're quite lucky that we do have quite a bit of influence, but if we had no influence and if we were making no difference, we still have given young people something to put on their UCAS, on their CVs. We've given them an opportunity to write a speech, to give that speech, and for me that personal development is rewarding enough to see in myself and also my friends.
And I think you're right. I think that the skills, the experience that you learn as part of the process and being involved might be enough. But actually what you've both said to me already is that's part of the story.
Yeah.
And the issues and the areas that you've been involved in. And you've both talked already about the importance of the voices of children and young people being heard and being part of this work. I think you both came to this because you had issues that you really cared about, that you were passionate about, and actually this feels like a really good way to advocate for them, for all young people. So you've got that platform. Can you tell me a wee bit about some of the issues that you've been involved in, some of the projects that have maybe been closest to your heart, that you've been able to make a difference in?
Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I've recently joined the Scottish Youth Parliament's newly formed education reform team. So I can't wait to get that project off the ground with all the other team members. It'll be very exciting to see what comes out as a result of that. I've done some previous work through Edinburgh Council. I've been part of youth panels where we've been interviewing for the Service Director of Education and the Head of Education in Edinburgh Council. So it's been great to have young people's voices being heard into who is running their education system. So that's been really exciting to be part of.
That sounds brilliant, and it picks up on the point I think, Olivia, you made earlier about things not being done to young people, but with them.
Yeah.
So having a voice in a senior recruitment process gives you a real opportunity to talk about what matters to young people as part of that process. And I'm smiling about the education reform work because our organisation is part of that education reform space. And for us, it's really, really important that we include young people right at the start of that work. But it's great to hear that you're involved in the national part of that through the Youth Parliament. So I'll be equally excited to see where that goes. What about you, Olivia?
So the Scottish Youth Parliament is completely youth-led. So we're a charity, and our chair is 21. I think the youngest person on our board is 18. I joined the board when I was 17 and I've just kind of stayed. So I now vice chair the organisation, and I've been very privileged to not only be involved in the delivery of a lot of what we've done, but also like the design of it and deciding the strategic direction. Like, no decision is made in the Youth Parliament that hasn't involved young people at some point in the process of that decision being made. And some of the one thing that I'm probably the proudest of that I've been involved in is delivering our campaigns. We run 3 big national campaigns for every membership. The MSYPs at the start of their term, they go away, they consult their constituents, and then they vote on what our big national campaign should be. Currently, they're on mental health, ending gender-based violence, and youth work. So all things that link really well to education. And that's something that I've found throughout every campaign that I've been involved in and every project that I've been involved in. Education is a very fundamental aspect to it. And there's a lot of issues I think can be solved if we had an education system which properly served the needs of young people. So yeah, those campaigns and being on the board, setting the strategic organisation of the strategic direction of the organisation are probably the things that I'm most proud to have been involved in.
And I'm just reflecting when you were talking about being on the board. In my spare time, I'm a member of a board, a Citizens Advice Bureau board, and I'm the oldest person on that board, which is really unusual because there's a perception around boards that quite often retired people, quite often males, so there's a piece around gender balance in boards, but I'm really passionate about young people being part of boards across the country. So actually it would be great if, as an outcome of some of your involvement here, is that you don't lose that board interest and become, apply for boards across Scottish public service that would really benefit from the voice of young people.
And we at SYP were doing quite a lot of work to make even our board more accessible to the young people. But like, every person who's sat on one of our boards has gone on to do something really incredible with themselves, and there's a real diversity in the career paths and the study paths that they choose for themselves. But quite a lot of us have gone on and sat on other charity boards. So we are big believers in making those spaces more accessible to young people, because we need those voices at the very top of an organisation.
Yeah. That was an aside, but I think a really important point to make. You've both talked about education, and I want to pick up, not surprisingly, on some of the issues that young people are particularly involved in or anxious about in education. We're recording this just as pupils in Scotland are wrapping up their exam periods and thinking about their next steps. By the time this publishes, young people will be receiving their exam results. But for both of you, I know much closer for you, Abby, but that experience isn't a distant memory for either of you. You touched on it about the exams during COVID, actually, Olivia, when you were talking. When we run the Developing Young Workforce programme, we quite often talk at exam time about no wrong path and about really encouraging young people to think differently, to think about their own unique journey, and rather than being worried about what they might not do or what people want them to do. So we really encourage them to view their learning as opportunities for, as you talked about, learning, adaptability and resilience. But if you could rewind, and Abby, you're right in it, what advice would you give to young people now who are transitioning from school and thinking about further studies, a career path, and if they haven't made decisions yet, how would you encourage them to explore several paths about what might interest them?
Well, I think with that phrase, no wrong path, it's absolutely true. But especially when I was younger, someone would say, oh, what's your path? And I perceive that as being, you've got to do something and commit to it forever. which is absolutely not true, and I wish I'd known that at a younger age. After school, I left after S6 and I went to do Spanish and politics at uni. Made it to second year, and I'm now on a year out, which is kind of like taking a gap year halfway through and trying to decide if I want to go back to uni.
Okay.
Because those 2 years taught me that maybe, I was really academic in school. I got all A's, and so therefore it was just kind of assumed that I would go on to uni. And it's absolutely brilliant that uni is a much more accessible thing in Scotland these days, but I think that has also come with the expectation that if you have the ability to go to uni, you should. Whereas I don't think upon hindsight that was the right path for me. So I decided to put a pause on it, and I decided I'll give it a year and I'll work and I'll think about it. I'm now having to figure out if I want to go back after the summer. But what I've learned is no matter what you choose after school, that isn't forever. You can choose something that's right for you in that moment and then change your minds later on. There's nothing that can't be paused. There's no career that you can't switch out from these days. Like, we're in quite a good time right now, because 20 years ago it was expected you'd pick a career and you'd do that until you retire. Now you're expected to sort of jump around a wee bit. So my advice would always be just trust your gut and be patient with yourself. You're not meant to know what to do with your life at the age of 17 or 18. And it is absolutely okay to change your mind.
And Abby, you're there right now. Is that good advice for you?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, whereas many people who don't know what they want to do, and that's completely, we are so young, and to make such a life changing decision, well, not changing, but obviously you can go back on your decision and pick a different career, but to start off your life and work, to make that decision when you're so young, it's hard. And it's definitely about trying new things to see what you like, what you don't like, ruling other things out. And at the end of the day, it's about following your heart to figure out, what am I ready to do at this moment in time.
And finding something you're right. Follow your heart's a great piece of advice. Find your passion. There's an old saying, find your passion and you'll never work a day in your life. But sometimes you have to try lots of different things before you find that passion. So I think that's really good advice from you both. You both talked about your time at school. Olivia, I think it was you that said, a decision might not always work for everyone. What challenges did you face when you were at school? You talked a wee bit about being academic, quite a defined path. But what were the challenges for you both during your education that have shaped you to become the person you are today?
I think coming out of COVID with all the exams, that was quite hard, because we didn't know exactly, all the papers had changed. Like, the assignments weren't in. It was all a lot of unknown, and that can be quite challenging to try and figure out how to get past that. And also, sometimes, it's just trying to navigate the academics, your life out of school. It's all a juggle. It's about finding that balance to figure out if you're happy, you're not happy.
I'm going to stick on the COVID theme for a minute, because I'm just thinking about what age you would both have been during the pandemic. So did you go into secondary school, Abby?
Yeah, going into
S1. You went into S1, so your transition was really disrupted.
Yes, that was definitely a massive challenge. We'd done a wee bit of transition before COVID, but we didn't get our 3-day visit. We were just basically, here is the school, find your way around.
Dropped into it.
Yeah, pretty much. And definitely, you look at what some of the S1s have now, and it's great, what they get buddies to take them around. But I think my year and a few years below that really did struggle.
Suffered from that.
Yeah.
And you were slightly further through
Yeah.
You came out almost at the kind of exam piece then, you were saying.
Yeah, so I was 15 when the pandemic started. I just managed to do my Nat 5 prelims and then we went into lockdown. And so those prelims are the only proper exam that I ever really sat in school, because Nat 5s were on predicted grades, hires were the same, and then when I made it back for advanced hires, it was still on an adjusted course. So my school experience was hugely disrupted, and that was one of the biggest challenges, and the biggest challenge for a lot of my peers at the time was that like uncertainty. And I think we forget how much uncertainty there was during the pandemic, how we thought we'd be in lockdown for 3 weeks and then it was like 3 months, and then there was another lockdown, and then life is only really now just beginning to kind of go back to normal. And I think you make a really good point about that transition. We're now having a huge conversation in schools about behaviour in schools, and how the mental health impacts that we're seeing upon young people, the rise in misogyny in young men. And I really believe that a lot of that, it's happening to this like particular kind of point in our generation, and it's those kind of 4 years that were really heavily disrupted by the pandemic. And then, as you say, we're just dropped back into school and not really given much support thereafter. And as I say, we've just kind of moved on a bit too quickly from that as a society, I think.
I'm going to come back to a couple of those other issues that you picked up there, but just before we move on from COVID, we talk about decision makers. During the Right Way programme, we talked a lot about the role of decision makers. I was a decision maker during COVID. I was a member of the leadership team here. I was part of the COVID education recovery group. You said earlier it felt that a lot of things were done to young people. With hindsight, what would have helped if decision makers had taken different decisions? Is there anything that springs to mind?
I think the main thing that springs to mind is always the point that like our education system needed reform before the pandemic. The pandemic just exacerbated a lot of the issues, and I think upon hindsight, had young people already been a bit better involved in education decision-making process in the lead up to the pandemic, we would have been able to adapt a lot more quickly and adapt with solutions that suited young people better. Because it's very, I know like the COVID inquiry is happening and whatnot, and it's very difficult to criticise some of the decisions that were made in the pandemic because it was so unprecedented and we were all panicking.
And made in time.
Yeah, like we were just trying to put a system in place, no matter if it was education, the NHS, you know, your home life. You were just trying to figure out a system that worked for this moment in time and survive. And that's what we so easily forget. And I think like the independent review of assessments and qualifications talks a lot about culture change. And I think that culture change around young people's voices came 5-10 years before the pandemic. We would have adapted so much more quickly. And you can see that in like the first set of exams that were disrupted, the way that they were initially done based off of postcode. And then young people protested that essentially, and it got changed to predicted grades, and that was what young people had always said that they'd wanted. And when decision makers implemented a system that didn't work for young people, they eventually had to change it to something that did work. So we will make our voices heard if we want to, but so much time and money and effort and panic could have been saved during that pandemic had our voices already been in the room and those youth voice structures had already been in place.
And there's a big piece of learning then for the future. You know, when we look outside just now, you know, the global challenges that we're facing, the climate challenge, we touched on that just before we started recording. So there's a massive learning about involving young people, engaging young people throughout, rather than at the end or through conversations, so that we can face whatever uncertainty a nation, because we don't know what the future will bring. So I think there's a strong message there. Abby, anything you want to add to that?
I think definitely, as you were saying, Olivia, we never got a say during COVID, it wasn't. Obviously, young people were voicing their opinions about how we want the exam structure to work, but that wasn't taken into account immediately. And it would be great, and it would have probably been better if they'd asked us from the beginning, what do you want this to look like?
Mm-hmm.
So that we could have more say, and it's not just exam results. It was like the education system, obviously we were all in lockdown, we couldn't have gone to school, it wouldn't have been safe.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more consultation should have been done about how do you want this home learning to look like.
Yeah, or it should have been. It's difficult because, again, at the start of a pandemic, like, we had 3 weeks basically to figure it out and adapt. And that's where I think it's so important that we take the lessons learned from that and think, right, that work needs to be done ahead of time. Next time that work should be, that youth voice should be embedded within an organisation, within the structure, so that when, God forbid, a crisis like that happens again, it's there. It's there. And it's, those resources are there to draw on, and you've got that bank of information and consultation that shows you this is what young people want and this is how we're going to do it.
And I'm going to talk in a wee bit about the Right Way programme. And because actually my learning about meaningful participation as part of that has been really, really powerful for me. Before I do that, I want to take us out of the pandemic, you'll be pleased to hear, to bring us to issues that we're facing today. And we've touched on misogyny, we've touched on gender-based violence, we talked before we came online about use of technology and mobile phones in schools. Is there anything just now that you're hearing from young people that makes you think the Youth Parliament, education needs to do more about some of those? You talked about campaigns, but what are the biggest things that are taxing young people right now, and what can we do more about?
Well, you've hit on some really pertinent points around misogyny and social media, access to information, political literacy. Those are massive things impacting young people right now. Like, where do we get our information from? You think about the rise of AI, that's massive now, and it's only going to continue being an issue unless we learn how to adapt to it. So those are some of the really big things that come up. But it's also the kind of undercurrent that runs through everything is around opportunity and access to opportunity. And I think a lot of that points to how the youth work sector is really, really struggling right now. And we seem to have lost hold of that vision of education is not just exams and academics. It's what you learn at Girl Guides, it's what you do at your sports club, it's what you learn at youth parliaments and stuff like that. And over the last 5-10 years, the youth work sector has just been continually defunded. And I really like the phrase third spaces when we talk about young people, how your first space is your home, your second space is school. And if you're not in either of those places, where are you? You should be in a safe place. It should be a youth work setting. It should be somewhere, even just a centre where you can sit and hang out with your pals without any sort of structured, organised fun. And we don't have that anymore, and we don't prioritise that anymore. And I think that is why we're seeing a lot of issues like the rise of antisocial behaviour. We're talking a bit about behaviour in schools, that's already been mentioned today. And just the fact that young people don't really have a space outside of school to develop their skills and abilities and social skills as well. And so if you don't get along with school, where do you go?
And you talked about one of the current campaigns being youth work. Are those the kind of issues that you're aiming to address through that campaign?
So the specific call is to properly fund the youth work sector, basically. And to give young people those opportunities back. That, like, I think back to when I was sort of 10, 11, 12, and every night I was at gymnastics, dance, swimming, brownies. I think I had something on every single evening, and some of those things were free, and that just doesn't really exist now. And that is why I think we're losing a lot of young people to people like Andrew Tate online, really radical far-right views, misinformation, reliance on AI. Like, there's a lot of things I think that can be solved if young people just had more support structures in place.
And what can schools do in that space? We talked about the role of youth work, but what can schools do to support young people more in that space?
I think definitely having more people who are maybe available after school, like a designated room in schools set up after school, saying, after school, come in here, we can play some games, do some activism, whatever it is, just for young people to go in, ask any questions, and just be together.
And some schools are really good at that.
Yeah.
But there's maybe a query around consistency, equity,
That was just
availability
about to be my point.
across the country.
Yeah, like, the thing in Scotland is your experience of school vastly differs depending on what school you're at, and that's because of teacher turnover. That's because of, there's some aspects of the curriculum that some schools skip because there's bits of it that are very flexible. Like, we went to school miles apart, but your school experience will vastly differ from mine. And the issue is, I think a lot of the time schools are really doing their best. Like, we're seeing youth voice structures be quite seriously implemented. We're seeing the Rights Respect in Schools programme having a lot of success. And I think a lot of the issues that young people are facing are really structural issues, and I really feel for like the guidance teachers and the PSE teachers who are doing their absolute best to support these young people, but it's like 30 young people to one guidance teacher. How can they manage that?
So big challenges then.
Yeah.
Big challenges. And I'm not sure we'll get the solution during our podcast. However, part of the way to a solution that I'm hearing loud and clear from both of you is about how young people are actively engaged in the planning, the thinking, for what works for whatever that community is.
Yes.
Because I think when we talk about it's equity of access, it's not quality of access, because the needs might be very different depending on where people live, as you say. I want to talk a wee bit now about the Right Way programme. I mentioned in the intro, Olivia, that you actually mentored me through that programme. It's delivered by the Scottish Youth Parliament. It's funded by the Scottish Government Children's Rights Unit, and it provides training, resources, research, support to folk like me who work in government, public sector officials looking to practice meaningful participation of young people in their work. And I thought before I took part in the programme that I was really quite good at that. Taking part in the programme told me that I wasn't nearly as good as I thought I was, but actually gave me really concrete learning to improve how I do that, but also how I encourage others to do it. And I've actually found it's probably, in all the learning that I've taken part as Interim Chief Executive of Education Scotland, it's probably the most valuable learning that I've taken part in. I found it really valuable. I found the challenge, and Olivia, you were challenging, as was the programme, around, think about that, the scenario work, etc. So it's made me think really differently about how I make sure that in all that I do, that I am making sure that young people's views are taken seriously. And I do that, I'm going to say in the right way. That sounds quite cheesy. So I found it a really positive learning engagement. And the scenarios piece in the programme really was the bit that made me think differently. One of the scenarios was was playing out an event where young people had been asked to participate in a government meeting, but the purpose wasn't clear. The purpose of what the feedback would do wasn't clear. And I see things like that and think, actually, my goodness, we let that happen before. So it's been really, really powerful for me. Olivia, I'm going to come to you first because of your involvement in the programme. Can you talk a wee bit about your perception of the programme and why you think it's so important? You don't need to give me my mark for participation.
Well, my mark would be top marks. It's been really brilliant working with you, because I think I could probably take some notes from the right way training, and that I did come in with a bit of bias, because I think so often young people's perception of education is like, oh, it's all these teachers and adults being really serious and making decisions about exams. And so I'd been a bit hesitant coming into it. And then I met you, and right off the bat, I was actually really surprised about how much you already knew, and about what an understanding you already had of the UNCRC and meaningful participation, and like the very clear dedication that you already existed to involving young people's voices. So immediately I was at ease, and thereafter it was like every session was brilliant. But to me, like the Right Way project has been through a number of phases. It started as a website, then it was training for civil servants. We've began to wrap it in with our meetings that we have annually with the Scottish Cabinet and the Directors General. And this mentoring programme now felt like the kind of natural next stage. So you're not the only mentee. There were 7 others across various other bits of government. We are, I believe, rerunning the programme next year as well. So fingers crossed this is now a long-term thing. And it's just been really enjoyable to sit down and like dig into what your role is. But like, I'm very conscious of the fact that I know what you learn from me is going to help with that culture change that I mentioned earlier, and it's going to set an example for so many other people within not just Education Scotland but government. So it's been quite a privilege to kind of have hours to sit down with you and just chat, basically, because all we've done is yap.
And folk who are listening, Olivia, that know me or you probably won't be surprised to hear us both say that.
But yeah, and just spend like dedicated time digging into what is Article 12 of the UNCRC, what is meaningful participation, what are seldom heard groups, and knowing that like you have all that knowledge now, and that you're sort of fighting young people's corners within education is very comforting for me to know, I think.
That is, you're making me fill up actually as you're saying that. This is going to make me sound like I'm on commission now, but you talked about the programme potentially continuing and growing. If someone's listening and they're thinking, I'd really like to be involved in that, how do they make that happen?
I believe that we've sent out something. I don't know quite the logistics, but if you haven't heard anything, you'll be hearing about it soon. But I can talk to like the fact that sometimes like when you do get to the point of signing up for these things, it is really daunting, and especially like you can perceive it as, oh, this is yet another thing to take on top of everything else. And to that I would just say, go for it. Like, you've not really got anything to lose. Like, you will learn something from us, but on the absolute off chance that you feel you've learned nothing, then you've had an hour of your day to sit down and have coffee and a yap. Like, you just have nothing to lose. And I think especially it is so important to talk to young people in particular, because adults do make a lot of assumptions about us, and we face so many barriers to participation in public life that a lot of other groups don't, because so often we're in full-time work trying to support ourselves, we're in full-time education. It can be things as simple as like, we rely on public transport, so if there isn't public transport to get to a particular event, then we're not going. It's things like that a lot of the time I think adults miss and adults forget as they get older. So just go for it, and like the proper meaningful participation of young people results in better policy making and long-term solutions. So why would you not want to make your job easier and more efficient in the long run?
And I couldn't agree more. It takes me back to when Abby was talking earlier about being brave and putting yourself forward for the Scottish Youth Parliament. There's actually a bit, as you go through your career, you might be thinking, oh, what if I can't engage in that programme, or what if I don't get it right? So I think we're following your lead by stepping into that space and saying, actually, I don't know everything that there is to know.
Yeah, and it can be so scary working with a different generation or someone who's from a completely different background to you, because you just don't know what that conversation is going to be like. But
how exciting is that?
Yeah, and like, I've loved working with you. It's been so interesting.
I'm going to stop, or people will think I've paid you to be saying. I'm really conscious that we've talked for a long time, but I just want to round up we've talked a couple of times about the importance of this work for us as a nation. And the vision for Scotland is of a nation that actively listens to and values the meaningful participation of young people. Folk are in different journeys to get, are different stages in a journey to get there. And I know we could talk for hours, but before we finish up, what's your hope for the future? What's your hope for Scotland, for the future? If you were to look ahead to the next 10 years, what impact do you want to have on Scottish politics? Taking it back to education, how do you see that landscape changing to further support the voice of children and young people? It's just a wee question to round up our podcast.
I think it's a great question. I definitely think we need a Scotland where young people's views aren't just heard, they're taken upon. Whereas it's currently, I feel like we're sometimes heard, it's sometimes taken action on, but it's not always. So I think it would be great to take that a step further. And I think definitely young people have spoken about what they feel should happen, and some action based on what young people say would be great.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Like, in 10 years, like, we've just incorporated the UNCRC into Scottish law, which is a great first step, but now we need that culture change, and we need rights to be embodied in every aspect of public life, and we need young people's voices properly and meaningfully involved at every stage of the decision-making process. And I do think that we are on the right path with that journey. Looking at education more specifically, I would love to see really progressive, radical education reform. I mentioned the independent review of assessments and qualifications, that we were involved in that review, and it is very reflective of what young people think and want. And we have such an opportunity right now for Scotland to be a world leader and to create this visionary education system. And I think we are doing such a disservice to our young people and to the next generation if we don't grasp this opportunity now, because otherwise we are just going to be in the same room in 10 years having this same conversation. Yeah.
And actually what I'm hearing from you both is, you know, we're on that journey. We've used that phrase a few times. So there's listening, there's engagement. What I'm hearing from you both is more action.
Yeah.
And more pace, probably. More action and more pace. I'm going to wrap it up. I know that we could talk for another hour, but I'm going to wrap it up there. I guess my reflection on the conversation that we've just had is, and no pressure on your shoulders, but Scotland's in safe hands. If we've got young people like you two advocating, championing and engaging, then I'm confident that Scotland is in safe hands. So I'd like to thank you both very much for joining me today. I'd like to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you've enjoyed our podcast, hit the follow button for a notification when a new episode is published. And if you want to know more about how we're supporting this work, you'll find that on our website. So keep an eye out on our social media pages for news on the latest episodes. And hopefully we'll hear from you soon. Both, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe for notification of when a new episode is published. If there is a topic you would like to hear featured on this podcast, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Follow us on our social media channels for all the latest news from Education Scotland. Education Scotland is a Scottish Government executive agency charged with supporting quality and improvement in Scottish education.